Hello, wonderful listeners. This is your host, Dr. Brian Peterson. This episode's guest is Dr. Phiona Stanley, who is connecting from Scotland. Dr. Stanley is an associate professor of intercultural communications at Edinburgh Napier University. Her research focuses on mobilities and how people engage in intercultural settings comprised of heterogeneous assemblages of humans, non-humans, and artifacts. Her research has a particular interest on how powerful normativities operate within intangible systems of mobilities. She has published several books, with her most recent titled An Autoethnography of Fitting In on Spinsterhood, Fatness, and Backpacker Tourism. For those of you interested in purchasing this book, you can get a 20% discount. The web link and the code is in the episode's description. Also, she has an upcoming peer-reviewed scientific manuscript titled Solo Trails/Trials for This Unlikely Hiker, Purpose, Purity, and Quest. Phiona, it's a pleasure to have you on Old Bodies Outside. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, so it's about 5:30 p.m. in Scotland right now.
Mm-hmm. What time is it with you?
It's about 11:30 a.m., so middle of the day for me. And this morning was actually a tough morning for me to get up. I usually like to get up and do a little bit of exercise with my dogs, and I set the alarm for 5 a.m. and had a hard time getting up this morning. I had to reset the alarm for 6 a.m. It was a bit of a late night last night. We had our big sports Super Bowl, and my local team ended up...
that was on. Was your team in it?
My local team ended up winning it, and not that I'm a big football fan, but it's kind of fun when it's your local team.
That's great. Was it Beyonce was doing the Beyonce or
Rihanna?
Yeah, that was the part I saw.
Okay, nice. Yeah, the visual effects of that with the kind of staircase type of stage that was hovering was really interesting. Did you notice how they were?
I didn't watch it. I just saw the news that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, like I was confused as Beyonce or was it Rihanna? So that's how informed about it I am. But how interesting that something like that happens in the US and it's such a big deal that I hear about it on the morning news in Scotland.
Yeah, I'm surprised by that actually. I'm not sure how the NFL is viewed outside the United States.
Yeah, I to be honest, like if you hadn't said it's NFL, and even then that's American football, right?
Correct, yeah.
Right, so I couldn't have told you what sport the Super Bowl actually was.
Well, I'm not overly huge into sports myself, but like I said, local team is kind of fun to watch.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's. I'm glad you had a good weekend of sports watching.
Yeah, and it caused me to get up a little bit later this morning, but that's okay. So let's get into our conversation, and I want to hear about some of your hiking, and I love hiking as well. I want to hear about from you. So for you, what is hiking about, and how has that evolved?
Yeah, I mean, hiking is such a big part of my life at the moment, although maybe less so in this time of year in the winter than it is in summertime. Scotland is pretty far north. I think it tracks across to about Alaska somewhere. So in the wintertime, it gets dark at 3 p.m., doesn't get light till 9 a.m. And in the summer, it's the opposite. It's light at 3-4 in the morning, and it's dark at 11 at night. Wow. So we're pretty far north, and hiking is, I think, something that you have to do in tune with nature, with what nature's doing. So I'm quite a fair weather hiker. I mostly hike in summertime. I did go for a big walk the other day, but the weather was so bad, and the visibility was about 6 meters. And I was thinking, my God, I've had better visibility underwater than this. This is completely ridiculous. It was just this big lid of fog came over. It was a bit like being inside Tupperware. Wow. It's just everything was really grey. So hiking is a big part of my life, but I want to say it's more of a summer thing. Which I think is probably true of many hikers, but I'm not a, winter mountaineer going up an ice shelf type person. Like I love the feeling of hiking. I love the embodiment of hiking. I love the feeling of getting somewhere under your own steam. But I think I'm much less somebody who kind of wants to tick off, this mountain peak or, this outdoor sufferfest, this challenge, this, I think I'm kind of type 1 and type 2 fun, and definitely not type 2 and type 3 fun. So what
Yeah.
does hiking mean to me? I love the experience of it. I love the fact of being out in nature. I love the thing of, taking a tent or going to a bothy and staying somewhere out in the middle of nowhere and feeling like it's, like I might be the only person for tens of kilometers around. There's something quite magical about connecting with the land in that way. So it's both a physical sensation and a connection with place, I think.
Yeah, that connection sounds wonderful. And it seems like you do a lot of solo adventures, solo hiking. And sometimes you bring along Vanessa.
Yeah, so I'll tell you the history of that. I used to camp and hike pretty much all the time alone. And I would go way, 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 way out into the forest because I was living in Australia. Until 4 years ago, I was living in Australia. And a lot of the hiking I've done has been in Australia. And I think it's probably true in the US as well, near a trailhead, there's some pretty dodgy people sometimes, especially if you're a woman going alone. So you have to go way out into the forest to be safe or to feel safe. And in 2017, I injured my foot, my heel actually. And so I couldn't walk as far. And I didn't feel like I was going far enough out to be safe. So I thought, well, I'll get a camper van. That seems like a really good way. And then I realized how much a camper van costs and that it's not cheap. So I built one. And the
Nice.
journey of building the camper van it ended up being a really cool process and really good fun. So I built Vanessa in Sydney, Australia, which, I rented I was living in a second floor flat and I rented space in a diesel mechanic workshop and I ended up becoming good friends with all the blokes from the diesel workshop. So I write about interculturality and this was the intercultural experience with, hanging out with a bunch of guys who on paper I had nothing in common with, but in fact we got along really, really well.
Wow.
Although they didn't always quite know, how to make sense of me and me them. So I built Vanessa in Australia and then I got a job in Scotland, which is where I'm from originally. So I shipped her over because I was like, I've built her, she's my baby. So I've got an Australian camper van, self-built here in Scotland. And I mean, it's absurd. I built it with a fan and no heater. And so I've had to sort of retrofit a lot of things. So I camper van alone because the van is small and is built for one. But I often park up and, walk in for a day or two or three and either go bothying, which is, well, I'm sure we'll talk about bothies, or, I usually take a tent as well if I'm going bothying because sometimes you don't find the bothy or the bothy's full or it's too nice of a night, you want to stay out and, be under canvas. So I quite often camp as well, but so sometimes camper vanning, sometimes tenting, sometimes bothying, and probably 80% of the time I do all that stuff by myself.
Yeah. And so two questions. I think let's touch on bothying. And are there secret bothies out there? That would be kind of touching on bothies. Are there secret bothies out there? And then also connecting these experiences to your research and how this has become something that's really highly incorporated into your research.
Okay, so bothying the word bothy is a Scottish word, I believe. And a bothy is an old agricultural building. They're usually little stone cottages. They've often been where agricultural workers have stayed, out usually in the middle of nowhere in Scotland. And so they've been, since about the 50s or 60s, I think, managed by the Mountain Bothies Association. And managed is a very loose term because there's nobody there. It's not like the European refuges where there's, staff on site. These are just empty cottages, but they're unlocked. And inside there's usually a fireplace. Sometimes there's armchairs. Usually there's a sleeping platform or a wooden floor where you make your bed. There's not beds. There's no electricity. There's no toilet facilities. They're just really basic little, like a stone tent, effectively. And so they're out in the wilds. And Scotland has a very specific history with its nature. And I think perhaps this is interesting for an American audience. I think when I've hiked in the US, it's quite a different experience from Scotland. And there's lots of reasons for that. One is you guys have rattlesnakes and bears and bobcats and all kinds of, properly scary stuff. We don't. There's not much in Scotland that can kill you. I mean, obviously you can fall off a cliff anywhere, but nature in Scotland is quite denuded. Nature in Scotland is quite partial, in the sense that Scotland was cleared of its original inhabitants in the 1700s, colonized, I guess. After the Jacobite rebellions, the English Parliament, which had become the British Parliament, wanted to clear out the Highlands of crofters and install sheep because they're more profitable and because the Highlands was the source of the resistance. And so you have empty glens in the Highlands where these stone cottages are often vestiges of where there had been population centres. And interestingly, a lot of the Scots who went to the US and Canada and Australia had been cleared off their land first. So although there's, free settlers in inverted commas coming out of Scotland, a lot of those people had themselves been moved off their land. So the bothying world of Scotland is connected to a really painful past, but it also means that Scotland's wild spaces are not entirely wild. Scotland was deforested. So as a result of that, it's quite boggy, because there are, parts of Scotland which really should be forested, but there were, there's been, how are we going to call Western civilization? We're going to call it civilization. We're going to say it's a particular relationship with the land that's not as in tune as an indigenous peoples have been. So North American forests were beautifully looked after until 300 years ago. Scotland's had much longer of that very brutalist relationship with the land. So Scotland is, we don't have wolves anymore. There's really not much in the way of nature out there. And there's some projects going on now to rewild Scotland. A lot of tree planting going on. But we have an issue, which is that one of the uses of land in Scotland is deer hunting. So there's an awful lot of deer, bouncing around all over these estates. And deer eat saplings, so if you have new saplings, you have to have big fences, and it means that the wilderness, in inverted commas, is not especially wild in Scotland. I can't really remember what the question was and where we were going with this, but I'm enjoying talking about it.
Yeah, that was a really interesting history. I did not know that, and I bet a lot of the listeners do not know that, but we're kind of focusing on what bothies are, because that's a Scottish term, and then also how this connects to your research agenda.
Sure. Okay, so my research is very broadly about interculturality. And I started off, my PhD was about Westerners teaching English in China. So intercultural in a kind of very predictable sense of people crossing languages, crossing nations. But to me, the intercultural is not just about nation-state boundaries. That's maybe the least interesting part of interculturality. I think the interesting part of interculturality is talking to somebody who comes from a different paradigm from you. So it might be, for example, an academic hanging out with a bunch of diesel mechanics. That's an intercultural engagement. And I was doing a lot of hiking, doing a lot of, interested in the outdoors, and realizing there's a lot of interculturality there too, because there are the dominant discourses of the outdoors media, the outdoors industry, to a great extent, I think, constructs the outdoors in a specific way, where, certain bodies belong in the outdoors and other bodies like mine don't seem to belong. And then there are voices pushing back against that. So there's this podcast, for example. I think this is an interesting example of interculturality. When this podcast speaks to a sort of outside magazine or something, that's an example of intercultural communication. So when I think of this as a research topic, really what I'm talking about is thinking about how, I don't want to call it resistance, because that sounds like quite an active process. I think sometimes it's just when people who are maybe atypical hikers, unlikely hikers, Jenny Brusso calls them, go out into the wilderness. How does that work? What happens in that space? And of course, I'm interested in it because I'm somebody who would think of myself as an unlikely hiker as well. So we'll unpack that term, I'm sure.
I think that term is very interesting, and I think like let's unpack it a little bit. What are with being an unlikely hiker? What's kind of just a clear definition of that, concise
Mm.
definition of that, and then
I think
secondly, go for
to
it.
get to unlikely hiker, you have to start with likely hiker.
Let's do that.
It's not my term, it's Jenny Brusso, who has done beautiful, very empowering, um, groundbreaking, really, work with. She does. I'm sorry, I don't know her pronouns. Her, she, they. I don't know. Jenny Brusso is a pioneer, really, in unlikely hikers, and it's become I think in the US you call it chapters, like local walk organizations,
Mm,
where people who maybe don't feel that they can access the outdoors easily themselves can go and join a group walk.
yeah.
But I think that is needed because there's a type of person who somehow belongs in the outdoors that we might call a likely hiker, and everybody else would be an unlikely hiker. So start with likely. If you look at outdoors media, outdoors magazines, hikers tend to be white, tend to be male in a very specific way. So muscular and slender, and well, slender is more of a sort of femme associated term, but you know what I mean, a certain physique. Young, but not too young, so sort of 20s maybe.
Hmm.
Um, Often hikers are portrayed going in sort of groups of two or three or four. So hiking alone, I think, is a type of unlikely hiker, unless you're a sort of Bear Grylls mountain man, in which case hiking alone is kind of normative. So what we're talking about really is the cultural normativities about what we think of as our kind of default, our factory settings for what a likely hiker is. And I think unlikely hiker is everyone who breaks those implicit rules. So somebody who's not necessarily a woman. There are plenty of women represented in outdoors media, but often women who are represented are there with a man. So it's heteronormative, but it's also women as a foil for men's engagement with the outdoors. And so where women go alone, often what you see in media, and there's research on this that I haven't done but that I've cited, where women will be, you know, in the campsite, doing, you know, cooking while the man's doing something macho, like, you know, reading a map or putting up a tent or whatever. And where women are doing outdoor activities by themselves, often the magazines will kind of humanize them with a story about how they love to cook, or they, you
Mm.
know, they have this cat, or they, you know, there's some sort of backstory that lets us see that they're not these weirdos, that they're, you know, they're kind of normal women, legible. So it's about legibility. We see unlikeliness around people who non-gender conforming. We see it around people who are not white. We see it around fat hikers. We see it around older hikers. We see it around people going alone, people who don't fit that kind of Bear Grylls stereotype. So to me, an unlikely hiker is everyone who isn't a likely hiker. And, you know, I think we talked a little bit up here about, and so then the interestingness for me is this intercultural piece of how do unlikely hikers then engage with these outdoor spaces, because of course the outdoors is not just a place that you go to, it's a social construction of what it means. For example, in the US national parks, there's a lot of signs that say healthy parks, healthy people,
Hmm.
which is a nice idea, that, you know, by having healthy parks, we have healthy people, but it's also the idea that people who don't code as healthy per a dominant discourse, like fat people, are somehow polluting the park by not conforming to healthy people. So it, I think, goes both ways, that sign. To me, that sign feels like it's very much fitting the norm of likeliness and likelihood in hikers.
It does feel like it's fitting that norm, and the likely hiker. I feel like it has this a strong root. One of its roots in just this romantic outlook of wilderness, and it's humans coming in to conquer, especially white men that are slender coming in to conquer. And then I think that kind of fits right there with part of that likely hiker aspect.
Mm.
But for the unlikely hikers that aren't fitting this heteronormative outlook perspective, there is a lot that has to go with fitting in, all these intangible constructs and social aspects of that. And so that's a very complex aspect of fitting in these outdoor spaces. Would you mind kind of untangling that complex aspect?
I mean, people have lived in the North American woods for thousands of years. They fit in beautifully. And then colonization lays a different layer out over that of what it means to be in the outdoors. So I think the idea of erasing settlement and imposing national parks, and you see it in New Zealand, you see it in Australia, you see it in South Africa, that's a very specific way of engaging with land that comes from a particular moment in settler colonizing. So I think when we think of fitting in now, we're talking of a very specific time period and a very specific thing. It's maybe slightly different in Europe, which didn't have that settler colonization laid upon the top of it. I think when I think of fitting in, so I have a good friend. He's an academic too. He's a triathlete. He's a straight guy. He's very macho and muscular, and he runs up mountains like an idiot. And his engagement with the outdoors, I'm sure wouldn't mind me saying this because he quite often talks about having an outdoor sufferfest. He engages with mountains in that. In Scotland, there's a thing called Munros. I don't know if you know about Munros. Munros are the mountains that are over 3,000 feet high. Okay. There's 280 of them. And people do a round of Munros, trying to tick off all the Munros. That's his way of engaging with the outdoors, is that conquering, that conquesting. That's a fitting in normative way of engaging with the mountains of Scotland. I don't really see mountains like that. Like, I'd much rather go for a walk around the mountain or through the glen, or walk to the bothy, or engage with the land for the land rather than conquering it and ticking it off. The fitting in thing. I mean, it's a broader piece too, of course, because when we think of fitting in, we might think of fitting in socially more generally. But I think as it specifically relates to the outdoors, how we approach what the outdoors is and what it means, there's a normative way of doing that, and then there's a sort of queer way of doing that. And I think what we're talking about here is queering the trail.
Yeah, queering the trail, queering the outdoors. And queering is a term that is historically a slur. It still has those historical roots, and people have been victimized by the malicious use of it. It seems like it's being reclaimed and being used as a more inclusive term for everyone. This isn't necessarily, put a identity on you or you, but it's inclusive of everyone. And I think going and saying, queering the trail, queering the outdoors, whatever experience you want to have out there, go for it. I think that they're all equal experiences. If you want to, tick off going up mountains, that's the experience that you want. If you want an experience where it's more of an emotional relationship with the land in different areas, and maybe you want some solitude to hit that level of emotional connection, that's awesome too. And I think there's a lot of depth to that as well.
I mean, I think it's interesting you say that, because I think what you've just said there is probably not what is implicitly understood in the outdoor industry, the sort of everybody having their own relationship and each of those relationships being equal, because this is something that's actually been researched quite a bit in tourism, the idea of road status being a way that we operationalize mobilities to narrate a specific identity. So, for example, in backpacker tourism, by that I mean kind of knocking around Asia for 6 months. I don't really mean like backpacking as a camping activity. There's a way of narrating identity based on places you've been and how, in inverted commas, authentic those experiences were, and how badass, how kind of off the beaten track you got. That's a way of establishing road status. And I think the same thing exists in the outdoor world, which we might call trail status, where sitting around the fire in a bothy, you've got a story about going up a mountain, but I've got a story about going up 4 mountains in that same day. So implicitly, I'm the better mountain man than you. So although what you've just said, I think is a very idealistic thing of, you know, each of us has our own relationship with nature and the land, and that's a beautiful thing. And I completely agree with you. I don't think that's the normative way in which, because human beings, my gosh, we just need to establish status all the time. We're like chickens, you know, and so anytime you get a bunch of people around a fire together or in a campsite together, or there's always this process of sort of who's the better mountain man and it is often gendered, it is often masculine coded. So to a certain extent, I get to sit it out because, you know, as a woman, I'm assumed to be somebody who's not going to be that engaged with the mountains anyway. So in a way, there's a bit of a pass. But I think it's not the case that, you know, each of us has our own relationship and that's all beautiful. I think, in fact, what it means is if we want to fit in and be accepted and be acceptable, we have to fit in a certain way. And by that, I mean not just, you know, comfortably sitting around a fire with strangers, although that's really nice. I mean, for example, things like if you have an accident out there on a trail and you get airlifted off a trail, people will say, gosh, poor Brian, he had this difficult, unlucky thing. And if I get airlifted off a trail somewhere, it'll be, well, what was she doing out there? Like, was she that irresponsible, really? Like, why was this fat woman who's turning 50, what was she doing out there? So the normativity piece is also about legitimacy.
Yeah, and I think gaining it's an unfortunate way that people seek to gain a little bit of social capital. And so I was thinking, I in 2009 I backpacked along the Pacific Crest Trail for a few months, and I remember if you come into towns and people start asking, how many miles did you cover today? How many miles did you cover this week? How many miles did you cover last month? And not everyone's hiking for that, but you have to fit in and have that conversation when that's not even the purpose of your hike. There might be hikers out there that don't even pay attention to that quantification of their hike. They're more so, you know, self-journaling, paying attention to, you know, their interior and whatnot. And so, like, having to even fit into those conversations, that's another piece of fitting it.
Yeah. And so I think when we think of the word queering, and you're absolutely right, it starts life as a slur, it gets reclaimed, much like the word fat. But I would use it more as a verb than as an adjective. I think it's to queer something might be, for example, to engage with those PCT discourses and to breach that, you know, way of talking and saying, how many miles did you do? I did one. But my God, I sat by a lake and it was beautiful, and I journaled and I did this and that. That's queering.
Yeah.
That's messing with the normativities. And that's a big part of what it is to cross cultures, is to expose what the normativities of a cultural discourse is.
Gosh, Phiona, though, like, I don't know if I'd have like the kind of courage and bravery to
Is that because
break
you're
that.
not fitting in?
Exactly. No, it would be so like you would have to swallow a little bit before saying that, and you're not sure what people's reactions are going to be. Despite that you had a glorious day, you hiked 1 mile and you kicked it near a lake and enjoyed the views. Saying
So
that out,
I'm going to say, as a provocation, I think you as a normative, likely looking hiker, if you would do more of that, it'd make it a whole lot easier for me to be able to say that.
there you go. I like it. I will do that. I will
I look
do
forward
that
to hearing how it goes.
Well, I got to make sure I got some courage, but I will do it. Well, let me get into the next question. So one of the things that, as I was preparing, I was just blown away by all the skills and experiences you have. I mean, you have the skills and experiences as an advanced expert hiker. I mean, you've done so much. You've traveled and ventured all over this world, a lot. But how is it that this often gets ignored and overlooked?
I mean, I can talk the talk, you know, when we all of us introduce ourselves and talk about ourselves, I can perform road status. But I'm aware that I have to do it because it's not congruent with how I look. You know, if somebody sees a picture of me, and I'm doing a little show at the Edinburgh Festival this year, so we had publicity photos taken for it this week, and I just look like a middle-aged woman. You know, it doesn't square with how I kind of present myself, but you know, that's reality. Yeah, so I feel like it's about a performance of identity, and identity work is performative. Yeah, I've traveled a lot, In the same way as I don't count off Monroe's, I don't really know how many countries, but I don't know, it's maybe 90, something like that. It's a lot of places, and it's not hit and run visits. It's, I've lived in China, I've lived in Poland, I've lived in Qatar, I've lived in Australia, Scotland, Mexico, England. And I've spent extended periods of time knocking around Latin America and East Asia and the Middle East and West Africa and Europe, of course. And all of that creates a sort of travel biography. And then the hiking and nature adventuring grows out of that, where I've, been in places, and it actually started really with going to ruins and just enjoying as much as the ruins being in the forest. And so then going, well, how do you access the forest without having to go to ruins? And the answer is you go hiking. So it sort of came organically through, knocking around the world as in my former career as an English language teacher, which lets you travel and live all over the place. So I feel like I can perform that, as I've just done just now. Listing off the credentials as a way of establishing road status or trail status. And I think the fact that I don't always do that, that's where the surprise comes, maybe, because I don't look like that's my background, Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And you got me thinking about the difference between our social identity that can be, very performance based, and then the personal identity. And, if there gets to be too much of a distance, how does that affect, say, mental health? I think that's something that's a complex topic.
Yeah. I mean, I think identity is always a negotiation between the thing you appropriate and the thing that's attributed to you. And so we have the subject identity that I claim for myself, and then the object identity that other people want to, project onto me or imagine for me. And all identity work is that performative negotiation between these things. And if you're somebody who, you look the part, it fits, then it's probably a whole lot easier. But I'm not that sure if I'm that bothered about people, misunderstanding or, making assumptions. And I felt that picture made me look very, I'll show you the picture if you're interested.
Yeah.
I thought the picture looked very, suburban and middle-aged and, all these kinds of words. But, that's also how I look. So maybe that's okay, It's, it feels a bit incongruous though when there's the picture. I don't know if you can see that.
Oh, yeah. Nice.
Right?
Yeah.
So if you just saw that picture and this is an academic who's presenting something at the Edinburgh Fringe, you'd be like, oh yeah, she's insert names, insert gap into the gap. So then maybe the fact that I'm then talking about this, the show is called Badass Spinsters, and it's all about rejecting the couple norm. So it's a different kind of queering also as a verb, but extending the idea of queering to the idea of, I would have been tried as a witch, for my lifestyle 400 years ago in Scotland. Scotland was the centre of witch trials. So it's all connected up to the idea of witches and the way that normativities work in society around coupledness. And so I think actually we have, we talk a lot about heteronormativity, but we've now got homonormativity as well, where it's become acceptable, very acceptable in almost every, well, certainly in the Western world, to, be in a long partnership with somebody who's the same sex as you. But what's much less acceptable is to be long-term single. And so, in a way, we've got homonormativity where, you can be queer, but as long as you're coupled, you're safe enough.
Absolutely.
So that's what the show's about. But anyway, in terms of speaking about it, in terms of the congruence or the incongruence between appropriated identity and attributed identity, I think it's a performative piece where you negotiate between the two. And that's where, likeliness or unlikeliness as a hiker, I think I probably have a bit more mileage I have to do to establish who I am than somebody who kind of looks like they fit in, they look like the part.
Yeah, I understand that. And I I mean, it's even, I was thinking about for myself, which, I'm very heteronormative, as it's very obvious. And I was thinking about, I struggle a lot just for the ways that people will manifest an identity that I'm like, that's not me. That's not who I am. That's not what I would do. And I struggle with that so much, but I'm coming from such a privileged point on that too. So I figured, that's something that is challenging right there, but it's got to be a lot more challenging when you are the unlikely hiker, because you're faced with it even more.
And I think that's a big part of why I mostly hike alone. I really don't enjoy hiking groups because you spend so much time doing that whole trail status bullshit. Sorry, can I swear on your podcast?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, you're good. No, we're okay with some slight colorful language.
You can edit me out if you need to. The Scottish girl with a potty mouth. Sorry about that. Yeah. So no, I mean, I feel like So I mean, I'm thinking about things like I walked the Lara Pinta Trail in Australia, which, for your listeners, is an absolutely incredible, beautiful trail in the Australian outback. And because it's very dry out there, there are 12 stages, and each of the stages has water tanks at the end of it. And so a lot of the time people camp around the water tank, and then you get exposed to all these conversations with other hikers. And I walked it alone, and this was maybe about 5 years ago. And the number of engagements I have with people who were implicitly or explicitly really saying I shouldn't be there. Things like, have you trained for this? I'm worried about you. And or the weirdest one was, are you training for the Lara Pinta Trail? Like, no, I'm walking it. Like, what do you mean? So in the end, what I started to do was, instead of camping by the water tanks, I would load up with, 6, 7, 8 liters of water.
Oh, wow.
And dry camp between them, just because I could not be bothered with all the natter and the carping and the nonsense. So that thing of like, when it's just me and nature, like, I'm pretty happy with that relationship. The difficult part is when there's lots of other hikers involved, and you either spend your time doing that identity work, which is emotional labor, or you are explicitly being judged, because then it's a short step from, like, if I fall over and roll an ankle or whatever, is there then a sort of, well, what was she really doing out here? The judgment tips over into it being actually quite dangerous. And it's not the dangerousness of me being out on the trail. Like, I'm pretty good at what I do out there. And I think in a way, hiking alone, you're sort of safer in some ways, because, if you and I go hiking together, I might assume you've got the map and you assume I've got the map. Whereas if you're hiking alone, you got to be sure you got the map. It forces you to be responsible for yourself. And I think in a way, I wouldn't really want to hike with somebody who themselves wouldn't hike alone. Because if they're going to be responsible for me, like, you want to be responsible for yourself. And I think sometimes on group hikes, nobody's really that responsible because everyone's assuming somebody else has got it. Yeah. So I think in some ways hiking alone can be safer. I have a PLB. That's also a personal locator beacon that makes me a bit safer. There's stuff you do to make yourself safer, but ultimately I think there is a risk to going with others if the assumption is that those others are doing all the safety work for you.
Well,
the emotional labor of performing competence, and I mean, I can do it, and I'm aware sometimes, like when I'm in bothies and people are sort of surprised, wow, and sometimes it tips over into what sounds like a compliment, but it's not a compliment. Things like, oh, it's just so wonderful that somebody like you is out here doing this. And the subtext, of course, is that you don't belong here.
Right.
That's when I do the exaggerated performance of, I did this trail and I did that trail and I, much harder, much, much further than any of this nonsense that you've just done, and then, but I don't want to make it into a competition,
No.
That's where going alone just takes away all that noise.
Yeah. It takes away those microaggressions, and those microaggressions have such a compounding effect.
I don't know that they're micro. I think they're more mesoaggressions. They're pretty aggressive.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're really well intentioned. You know, I think we have to meet people with where they're at. And if somebody is saying, as someone said to me the other day, so the most common are the things like, you know, almost there, which you would never say to someone like you, but they would say it to somebody like me. And then things like, it's easier going down than up, or are you out here on your own, on your cell, which is a Scottish thing to say, like, you know, good for you, on you. I was hiking Portugal late last year, and so people are from all over Europe, and someone said to me, la courage, like, you know, yay, go you, courage. So those aren't really, like, yeah, they're microaggressions, but they come from a good place.
Yeah, they are well intentioned, but they're founded in this normativity that we're talking about that needs to be disrupted. People need to be thinking about that, and they might have a good intention, but they have a lack of education behind it, and they don't realize that it's stuck in this normative rut.
Absolutely, but I mean, it's also like, we're not out there to educate these idiots, you know?
No, that's not our job, right? That'd take too much.
I mean, if somebody stumbles upon a podcast like this and hears themselves in it, well, that's maybe something good and useful and educative. But my view on it is like these kinds of comments, and occasionally I'll speak back to it, you know, where somebody will say to me like, almost there, and I'll say that to them, like, oh, you're getting there too, it's so good, you know, mess with it, because it's just like, wait, what? Why are you saying this to me? I'm not a child.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, it bothers me and it doesn't, you know. I went to a tourist office in Spain a year or two ago, and I wanted to ask information about some walks. I downloaded some information, and I just wanted to ask, you know, which is the bus you take to get to this trailhead. And the guy in the tourist office looked me up and down, and he said, that trail's too hard for you.
No way.
Like, there's an aggression. That's and the friend that I was with, who I'd been telling this to for years, you know, this is what happens. And she's like, do you think you're misunderstanding it? Maybe they're just being supportive. She said of that, she said, oh my God, that guy was really nasty. He was really wrong, you know? Absolutely. So I think it's risky to call all of this microaggressions when some of it's beautifully intentioned. And yes, the effect is that, but I think sometimes it's just overtly nasty, and that's the focus, I think.
Yeah, and that one certainly was overtly nasty. Yeah, especially
like, you're a tourist office. Like, you're supposed to encourage people to go up there, you know?
Yeah, and just the look up and down, that just had to feel gross.
Yeah, but you know, that's implicit in all the other ones too.
Yeah, it is. It is implicit. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Okay, so we're talking a lot about hiking alone and how much you love it, and there's a lot of gratification that comes with it. Solitude, escape. You don't have to mess with any of this social stuff that we're talking about. What else is comprised in the assemblage of hiking alone?
Yeah, look, as a researcher who thinks about the way stuff hangs together, and I'm thinking about the human and the non-human, I hike alone, but I'm actually not alone at all. So if I go onto an all trails and pull a route up, I'm not alone, because somebody's done the route before, and I have, you know, GPS on my phone that can follow that route. If somebody's described the route on a website, the fact that quite often in Scotland I'll walk to a bothy, so that bothy's been built there, that although I'm alone, you know, in the sense of one human body out in the wilderness, there's lines, there's traces of all the other humans that came before me that have made that possible. And then, of course, there's the non-human. There's, you know, the fact that there's animals out there, and there's, you know, there's weather out there, and there's, you know, the fact it's getting dark early at this time of year. If I go for a hike at this time of year and don't get to the bothy in time, it's going to be dark. And I better make sure I've got my head torch with me, because, you know, it doesn't matter the fact that I'm out there, nature's doing what it's doing. So I think you walk alone, but we're always at the mercy of the wider assemblage of the other humans who've gone before and the non-human others. And then if I get back and I post pictures of the hike on Instagram, which is mostly what I use, then I'm involving other humans in that as well. And if I go to a bothy, I went to bothy in October, and I met a really wonderful German woman, and we exchanged information and we stayed in touch. And then we swapped Facebook and we exchanged a few emails. And she was walking alone and I was walking alone, but neither of us were alone because, we've both come out of that exchange with a connection, a friend. And it feels paradoxical to bond over the fact of both going alone, but in fact the aloneness is what united us.
Yeah, that's cool. That's really cool.
I mean, I think in theoretical terms, we think of this as the, Deleuze and Guattari talking about assemblage. And the idea of an assemblage being a arrangement of elements where each of those elements is not reducible to its function within the arrangement. And I mean, this is definitely that, where, aloneness is predicated on all these other moving parts. Without any of those things, you couldn't really go alone. So to what extent are we really out there alone?
Yeah, I never thought about it like that. And that's really interesting that you brought it up and, point out like that. Like if I go, say, backpacking, hiking to a bothy, well, that bothy was built by someone. The path is there and get information about that from the internet. There's things inside the bothy that were left by people. There might be a logbook. There might be some coal to make a fire or something like that. And so that aloneness, yes, it's aloneness, but there's also other aspects of humans have been there that helped empower that aloneness.
That's right. And I think, nature itself is a construction. None of us are out hiking on, the Kamchatka Peninsula or somewhere. Like, that's where I would say is pretty untouched nature. Like, there's not many humans there. It's really hard to get there. You can't get permits to go there. Most people who do go there are dropped in by a helicopter and they're out heli skiing or something. Like, there's tens or maybe hundreds of people a year would go hiking in the Kamchatka Peninsula.
Yeah.
But that's not the same if you're in, the Scottish Highlands or a national park somewhere.
Right.
Like, that is very well traced lines.
It is.
So we're all of us retracing lines that other humans have traced. And, you fall over on a trail up there, probably somebody will be along in a minute.
Yeah. Couple notes. First off, you brought up Kamchatka, and I just was talking to my wife about that about last week, saying this is my biggest dream, that I want to go there someday. I want to go backpacking
Why
here.
There?
Because the remoteness for exactly what we're talking about, the wildness, and the level of adventure, where it'd be something that's very different from my backpacking in national parks, like you just pointed out. My backpacking national parks has a huge human history to it. You got this place that's very, very wild. It's very hard to get to. That seems like there's a lot of ability for things to possibly go wrong and really have that sense of adventure. They have to overcome those challenges. Where in a national park, you got some safety with you, whether you believe it or not. Like you're not that far away from getting help if something were to go super south.
Yeah,
and
sure.
And the second thing, have you ever read a book? I forget the author's name, but it's called On Trails.
Nice title.
Yeah. So write that one down, On Trails, and I'll have to email you the author's name. I forget it off the top of my head. But he talks about these, you were talking about, these trails and their lines, and they've been made up by humans. And he talks about just this, the depth of trails and the meaning of trails. And sometimes how some trails go really far back in history. Some trails don't, and some trails do. But then he also talks about this within the animal kingdom too, and how they leave trails for each other to gain knowledge. And trails are information conduits for animals, humans to gain more information. And so it's a really interesting book.
So I'm thinking of two things. I'm thinking of Tim Ingold's book Lines, which is all about this idea.
Yeah.
But I'm also thinking about the idea of desire lines. And certainly in Poland, for example, when they build the paths in a park, what they do is they wait for it to snow and they see where people walk, and that's where they put the paths in. So the desire lines become the paths, because that's where people are going anyway. So I really like the idea that, we have roads that started life as paths, that started life as where people wanted to go. And so all of our infrastructure comes from desire lines. But then you go somewhere like Kamchatka, there's nothing. There's nobody there. Personally, I'm not sure I would survive a day in Kamchatka. I think I'd be eaten by a bear on day one. But you do you.
I would have to probably bring some sort of level of defense with stuff because I'd be scared too. I don't know if that would mean bringing the shotgun or what. I don't own any guns. I'm not a active gun owner by any means, but I'd be pretty worried about my safety with those bigger creatures that are out there, and there's certainly some big creatures out there. But yeah, check out On Trails. As our conversation's winding down here, I wanted to just kind of conclude with where do you see your research agenda going in the next 5 or 10 years?
Oh, Brian, I wish I knew that.
To be discovered, right?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of have an answer for this. I'm at the moment, I'm really just chasing a lot of shiny things that, when something's interesting, I start thinking about it and writing about it. I want to write a little bit more about this idea of road status. And so I've coined trail status that's similar to road status. But I think we can think of it, now you talked about it as being a type of capital. I think that's a good way of framing it, a sort of mobilities capital, where we can think of the way people use their past mobilities as a way of establishing their present identity and negotiating that identity. It's been quite interesting looking at the exodus of people out of Russia during this crisis, how there's a type of Russians that call themselves global Russians that distance themselves from Putin. And I think global Russians is using the fact of mobility as a way of differentiating and creating a distinction in their identity and their status. There's also a wave of Russians going to Argentina to give birth, because if your child is born in Argentina, then they get Argentinian citizenship. And so the Argentinian government is now falling over itself, like, how do we stop this when Russians don't need a visa? So these waves of mobilities and these lines, I think it's really interesting how that works and how we use mobilities as a way of, establishing who we are and creating a distinction, like the sitting around the fire in the bothy, talking about all the mountain peaks that you've knocked off that day. So I'm interested in that idea. At a theoretical level, how does that work in the performance of identity? I'm also interested in the idea of the assemblage and what that means for qualitative research. So there's quite a bit of work in new materialism looking at the agency of the non-human. And I think that speaks to, for example, autoethnography, where we write from the perspective of the self, and that gives insights into the wider culture, the ethno. So the auto links to the ethno. But if we're problematizing the auto and saying that it's a contingency, it's an assemblage, then what does that mean for autoethnography? So I'm informed by, for example, Pacifica and Australian Indigenous framings, where there is no independent, autonomous auto. It's very much part of the wider collective, which is the community, but it's also the relationship with land and place and other things. So I think we've got some big questions to ask in that space. So I guess I'm still broadly thinking around hiking and outdoors, but I'm kind of now drilling down into these areas. I've also just done a piece on dark tourism, which is really interesting, all about people taking selfies at Holocaust memorial sites, and not so much why that's wrong, although of course it is, but looking in particular at the comments underneath these pictures and how social policing works on Instagram and TikTok, where people break the rules. So it's all about culture. It's always about culture.
Yeah, Fiona, it's been super wonderful to learn about your research, hear about maybe some future directions you might go in. I guess you can say research within the same world, but we're just on polar opposites.
Really?
I do park management and conservation, but I'm typically, I'm a GIS analyst of where people go. And so right now I'm doing two major projects. One is just looking at helicopter tours above national parks and how that creates a noise impact heard from the ground. And we 3D model that noise impact. So it's kind of how it spreads out like that, but also up in altitude to understand where places are getting hit the most with helicopter noise and then how to manage those. And I'm doing that all across national park units in the United States. And so that's just a lot of travel patterns of helicopters and GIS stuff. So doing that for park management and conservation. And then my other project is in California. And California is having a big problem with wildfires just getting way out of control. And this has historical aspects to it of how they were managed and whatnot. And because these fires are getting so out of control, there are forests in California that are preventatively shutting down. So in California, they're not known to get a lot of rain through the summertime. Pretty much, I used to live in California. I don't remember any rain happening in California. I lived there for the first 32 years of my life. There just wouldn't be rain in the summertime from about May to October, November. So things get really dried out by September. And so if things are really dry, really hot, these forests might preventatively shut down. And so how do you message to the public to stay out of these forests? We're preventively shutting it down. And so that project is looking at, we're going to model future fire potential. We're going to model where there's high visitation. We're going to go into those locations. We're going to survey visitors in those areas. We're going to understand their kind of experiential attributes of why they went there. We're also going to understand the ecological attributes of why they went there. And we're going to use all that information to construct some messages. And then we're going to put together a menu of messages, and then we're going to test those out on kind of similar locations and see if we can try to get people to stay off, say, one trail and go to the other trail. And we're going to test the efficacy of the messaging. And then ultimately kind of create different types of messaging too. One part that I left out was there is a diverse socioeconomic population in California. So also messaging to that diverse socioeconomic population. And so bringing all that together so that they can effectively message during preventative forest shutdowns, which is a challenging thing to do. So we're in the same world, but doing different stuff. So maybe you and I could come together, could bring in some sort of visitor travel patterns, GIS and analysis, and you bring in your part with it. And, it would be fantastic. But Phiona, it's been really, really wonderful hearing about your research. I love it. I think you're doing great stuff. I look forward to reading more of your stuff in the future. And before we conclude this episode, I actually wanted to speak to the listeners of this episode that in the description of this episode, please check it out. Fiona's recent book, there you can purchase it for 20% off, and I will provide the book code and the link to do that. Secondly, I'll also put in the description of the episode a YouTube link to one of Fiona's recent presentations, which I think you gave 4 days ago. Yeah, so that's awesome. Yeah. Okay, well, Phiona, anything else that you'd want to touch on before we conclude the episode?
I don't think so. It's been a really interesting conversation. I can't believe how quickly the time's gone, but
It's gone by really
true
fast.
When you're in that lovely flow state. So as with hiking, so with podcasting.
Yeah, I never thought about getting into a flow state during conversation. It's so true.
Yeah, really nice. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you. It was just so wonderful. I'm going to throw on the outro music, and we'll call it an episode.
Thanks.